There are three more specific questions that will be addressed. I said at the beginning, the overarching question is, how do we scale up financing? Three more concrete questions need to be answered for that. One is, where in the economy is financing needed for adaptation? Who are the relevant actors? Secondly, what is keeping financing from flowing? What are the barriers? And thirdly, what can public policymakers, public authorities, nationally in developing countries and internationally do about that? I'm going to now hand over to my fellow presenters. We'll start with Robert Tippmann, our partners in the organization of the event today, who's going to provide his brief perspective. But then we will move quickly to BMZ, more specifically to Mr. Frank Fass-Metz, who is the Commissioner for Climate Financing, Climate Policy and Climate Financing, the Special Climate Unit at BMZ, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And then we will give the floor to Ulf Moslener from the Frankfurt School on a study that we're launching today called Demystifying Private Adaptation Financing. Robert will tell you something more about another panelist. I'll stop here, and then I'll come back when we move into the moderated panel discussion in the second half of the session. Thank you for now. Robert?
Yeah, I would like to welcome you as the co-organizer. I'm with the German Association for Climate Protection and Emissions Trading. Unfortunately, the first part is not really mentioned also in the program. Just took over I'm the second chairman for international affairs this year, so I will reach out to the secretariat that we will reflect that in the future going forwards. We are in charge or responsible for the second part, or what you read in the title, the subtitle called Breaking It Down to the Local Planning and Decision-Making Level. And I want to briefly introduce to you where we are coming from. First, what are the association, what are we doing, why we are here, and secondly, introducing the topic and also the two experts, or one expert we brought along for the panel in the second, for the presentation, the second one who will be on the panel. And the association is, I think, registered with the convention since 2002 or so. Basically, we're moving from a pure industry association, which was basically designed around working on finance mechanisms, a lot on the mitigation side, but as well as if it comes to private sector engagement and finance. Also in the past, we did already events on adaptation finance. Basically trying, also what we try to do here is now stimulating action. Why do we need to do that? I mean, last Thursday, I think the colleagues from the emissions gap report from UNEP, the results from 2016 report were provided, and well, we have Paris, but that doesn't seem to be enough. If you look at what they predict is we are currently not on 1.5, we're on a 2 degree, more towards a 2 degree path, which means there are trillions of adaptation costs or related to public and private assets at risk. You'll see a little bit more about that later. There are some numbers, latest numbers on one of the presentations from the Economist research department from last year. Breaking it down to the local level. In my other life as a climate expert, the last 2-3 years I was working in the Middle East, East Africa, where, for example, also working with people from the or advising on the agri-food industry or farmers and questioning, I know something is going on. What is happening? What can I do? What are really these impacts? What are the options I have? What are the costs? That's where we're coming from. And we have brought along the colleague from Climatekos, a climate finance policy advisory firm that has started a collaboration with Addactis, which is an actuary firm. I'll say a few words about them in a minute. Climatekos has started thinking about this for quite a while, mobilizing private sector finance, And based on a study they've been doing for the EBRD in the Moroccan port sector, you'll see a little bit more about that in the presentation. That didn't go follow through. Now with Addactis together, there's a research plan has been developed and a team has been set up to try bringing hard financial and hard climate data together using an actuary modeling tool or software for scenario projection using stochastic modeling. Basically trying to combine climate science and expertise with actuary risk assessment, and trying to develop a powerful tool and expertise for private stakeholders in particular, but also for the public sector to be used to mobilize more adaptation private finance. And I think with that, I'll leave it with my introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Without further ado, can I invite you, Mr. Fassmetz, to provide the BMZ perspectives on this important topic?
Hello and welcome everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you on this interesting topic, because from my perspective, we talk a lot about finance on mitigation and way too little about finance and adaptation requirements. We know that climate change is happening and will impact the private sector as well as the public sector, of course, and the private sector needs to look in developed countries as well as in developing countries on how to react to the impacts of climate change. And this comes with a risk perspective, and I think this is much more in the focus of discussions, but it comes also with an opportunity perspective. Lesser, but it comes with an opportunity perspective. And it gives me great pleasure to see that we have today the opportunity to look on the financing dimensions and the financial markets, because from my perspective, it's key for transformation to climate resilient development that the financing sector, the finance sector, can play its function in providing finance for the private sector, also in the context of climate change. We know that the global production happens to a large extent in regions which risk to be affected by climate change. So it's a very crucial issue. And the question to me is, what is the appropriate approach from the private sector to react? How will the private sector absorb the risks of climate change they are confronted in their production chain? And how the financial sector in particular will be able to assess risks, behave appropriately, and continue to provide finance for investments. So it's very good to see that today we will learn a lot about that. Not to say that the issue is only related to the private sector. Of course, there's a role for the public sector as well. And I can say that for our German public climate finance, which comes from our ODA budgets, in 2015, Germany provided roughly 2.7 billion euros of public climate finance, and more or less 44% of this was dedicated to adaptation, rather to the public sector. But of course, we also have the intention to catalyze action in the private sector. As we know, the mobilization of capital for investments in the context of climate change is key. So we would be eager to learn, and hopefully we will learn a little bit in this regard, on what is the role of different actors. How can public sector eventually provide an enabling environment? What would be the financial requirements to provide incentives eventually? And what can be the role of the financial market? Bonds, stocks, equity, banking system. These are critical elements, I think, where the task from the Paris Agreement to shift global investment streams also needs to be applied to the private sector. I can give you a little bit of flavor what we feel the G20 could look at. As you know, Germany is taking up the G20 presidency. Probably you all know that the Financial Stability Board is looking on what are the risks related to climate change to the finance sector, and will come up later this month with recommendations. And the G20 will look on these recommendations and how to move forward in providing guidance on how climate risks, the mitigation side, issues related to stranded assets, but also the issues related to the production chain can be included in decision-making through providing increased transparency and broader knowledge. And we will also look on improving dialogue between public and private sector, and among private sector between developed countries and developing countries, on how to integrate the issues related to climate change in decision making. I have a lot more on my speaking notes, but I think I should stop here because I'm eager to listen to you and learn about the results of the study on demystifying private adaptation finance. Thank you very much. And I hope we end up not in a mystery anymore, but much more knowledgeable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I should mention that UN environment colleagues of mine have been working and providing the secretariat to the Green Finance Study Group under the G20. So it'd be great to see how this can continue under the German presidency, and perhaps not only on green financing, but also on resilience financing. Now we've heard a lot on the framing for today. Now we're going to move into the substance, and you're going to hear two presentations now. First from Louis Perroy, sorry, from Climatekos. And I just want to tell you how the two presentations relate to each other. The first one, Ulf will give you the helicopter perspective, really, of 1,000 feet above, looking down, different actors in the economy, public, private, financial, non-financial. How do they interact? How they need to interact to deliver adaptation. It's a very broad landscaping exercise. And then Louis will focus on a very specific tool that aims at informing infrastructure decision makers with climate risk assessments so that they can make more informed decisions. So, very different approaches, perspectives, but obviously in the same context and very complementary to each other. Ulf?
Thank you very much, Remco. I'm really happy that I have the opportunity to talk a little bit about what we did over the last time. We're actually even trying to land the helicopter a little bit. So just two words on our institution. We're the Frankfurt School UNEP Collaborating Center, and we're actually focused on climate finance. So we're a bit, if you want, the knowledge hub of UNEP when it comes to climate finance, and also connect this a bit to the academic work. The Frankfurt School is actually a research-oriented business school, so academic work is also at the heart of our interest. But we're also basically a think and do tank, also writing applied studies and implementing findings in the field. But what I'm going to focus on today is actually a lot of thinking on the adaptation side, on the financing side of adaptation, and what the role of the different actors is. That study hasn't been done by us alone. We've profited a lot from intense discussions with the colleagues from GIZ here, from DIE actually as well, and the UNEP colleagues. And so that's actually quite a joint effort, and we're very grateful for all these interesting discussions we had. Now, just to introduce, because in that subject, there's actually quite many definitorial discussions. So I'll just be clear about what kind of working definition we adopt when we talk about adaptation. And actually, first of all, also when we talk about adaptation from the perspective of the private sector, from the perspective of individual businesses. So the first thing we start by adopting is like that from the individual business, climate change is a completely exogenous thing. It's an exogenous structural change. When we're here at the COP discussing about global mitigation targets, of course, that is not, you know, exogenous because we talk about the emissions. But if you are an individual business, what happens with the climate is basically exogenous. That's the first thing. And also, what is our understanding of an adaptation-related project? There is definitions of what adaptation is at the IPCC level, but from an adaptation project's perspective, we adopt, that has to be clear from the onset, we actually adopt a very, very broad perspective on that. We actually call adaptation, an adaptation-related project, a project that is shaped different because of climate change, if you want, as compared to a situation without climate change. So it's you know, it's a bit in line with what was already said, that adaptation is actually the ordinary business decisions in the way that are shaped by climate change, different because of climate change. Now, what are the most relevant actors in the scene here? We've just, you know, divided them by looking at public and private actors. Here on the public side, obviously, we'd have the governments across the world, you know, and the public finance institutions, their financial arms, quite frequently shaping the environment, basically the financial environments in which decisions are made and support and policies are designed. But on the private side, we talk about businesses, enterprises, basically doing businesses, but also as a separate part of this private side, the private financiers, which come in with different risk and return preferences. But that's a bit the focus of this study. So we're not talking about adaptation in the sense of development so much and distributional aspects, but we are focusing here on the role of the private sector. And that means basically those two parts. So those two balls, the enterprises and the private financiers, you would find again here. So what is the relation between the two of those? And also that has been alluded to already. It is basically that there's enterprises who do business, being in small, medium-sized enterprises, larger corporates or infrastructure providers or whatever. So they are doing business in an environment where the climate changes, and they're actually doing adaptation activities. They react to climate. And that's the first thing, quite important to note, that yes, of course, one big point would be to increase resilience. Climate change is happening. How do you react? Avoid damage in a way. Sometimes it's called downside issues. But also adaptation might generate business opportunities. We actually see a lot of cases where that happens, okay? Okay, what is that? In financial terms, that means that there's like activities done, projects undertaken, and in order to do projects, you need money. So money you get from somewhere. So someone is giving the money, and that's actually the other side. That's the sort of the activity. To perform the activity, you create demand for financing, but whenever there's demand for financing in the financing flow, there's someone else who is actually providing the finance and having the investment opportunity view on this. So there's also a supply of finance, okay? And this is what we look at and essentially trying to figure out, you know, how can we actually increase this? How can we bring supply and demand of finance together, looking at those, specifically looking at those two actors, but also as Frank Fassmetz has already said, also then we have to, when we think about an agenda that comes out of that, we also have to widen the view to the public sector and the policy environment that is basically, hopefully, you know, catalyzing those financial flows. Now, what are these adaptation activities? I want to zoom in a little bit and look at what is it that we're in concrete terms talking about. So how are businesses shaped by climate? Well, because they suffer from, or at least are subject to climate impacts. There's some climate impacts. There's many ways how you could structure them. Here we've just started with like water scarcity and drought, increased flooding, extreme heat event, or health-related risks. So some more direct, some more indirect. The main point here being that's a very heterogeneous field already. If you can imagine, or what could be concrete impacts. There's not just the weather variables, the climate variables, the physical things that change, but in terms of economic consequences or business consequences, this is actually very large. It's very broad. Okay, then we think about, okay, how, where does this have an impact? Where do these climate impact fields matter? And in order to do that, we have actually looked at some different types of activities. There's ways to structure that, but essentially, you could think about corporates or small and medium-sized enterprises as one class, and perhaps the really large infrastructure actors as a separate class. And then, you can look at the different business activity areas and see whether stuff happens. For example, for corporates or small, medium-sized enterprises, there could be upstream concerns related to water scarcity, people trying to, or drought, people trying to develop resistant crops and things like that. And it goes, you can pick your favorite example, but there's loads of activities, and then well, they're suffering from different impacts, are a reaction to different impacts. And what we've done there, this is really like it's a pity that I can't go into detail in this. We've actually looked at 30 real adaptation case studies across the world, and that's been quite interesting to see, what is actually happening. And they have been also the base on for what we try to look at in more detail. So now we see lots of activities, but as Remco said in the beginning, financing isn't really flowing. So supply of finance isn't really matching the demand of what would need to be done in order to make adaptation work, to do adaptation at the required level, if you want. So what you can actually say, finance isn't really flowing, so there's somehow barriers to financing, to finance flow. So barriers are there. Now, I've already told you at the beginning that I've adopted a very broad perspective on what adaptation-related projects are. Now, as compared to the classical literature, when we talk about barriers, we actually adopt now a very narrow understanding of what a barrier is. Actually, that understanding, and it sounds a bit theoretic, but I promise I'll move to very practical issues quite soon. We actually talk about this as being something that actually keeps that prevents the socially optimal level of adaptation investment. So actually something that makes investments not happening, which should happen from the perspective of the whole society. Okay, so what you might realize, this is actually a reference to some hypothetical social optimum. Okay, that's a theoretical benchmark, if you want. And it's, yes, I am an economist, but I'm not referring to this theoretical benchmark because I think it is realistic. It's actually not, it's a utopia, if you want. But what it does, it provides us with a compass, okay? If we have this understanding of a barrier, then automatically overcoming this barrier has the huge advantage that it actually improves, the situation from an economic perspective. So looking at those barriers, we've taken all the case studies and looked at what is it actually that happens. Now, we don't have to go into this in detail now, but there's some issues where you can actually see that markets, don't work perfectly, where we call that market imperfections. One simple example would be the generation of public goods. You might do something that has a larger benefit than just your own commercial benefit. That is something where the market does not incentivize you properly to do it, because you're just getting your cash flow from your private idea, but generating much more value for the rest of the society. There's imperfections on the capital markets, which I'll talk about in an example that makes probably more useful now. But there's also examples where complete markets are missing, like in many places there is no price for water, at least no price for water which is formed by the market. Well, do you want this? Do you want a market price for water? This is all to be debated. Of course, we take a flexible view, and policymakers should be able to decide what the proper approach is. And so, that's one thing that we've done here. We've looked at the individual, market imperfections, which will soon be more concrete. And yes, there's a theory side to those market imperfections, but guess what? If you talk to an investor, he really doesn't care whether that's the missing internalization of an externality or something weird, something theoretical. He just cares, does it reduce my return? Okay, so what this mapping does, it is actually looking at the theory, if you want, of the underlying mechanisms why the market is not perfect, but then it maps this. Okay, how does that look like from an investor's perspective? Does it have an impact on risk? Does it have an impact on return, or on both, or whatever? So that's the key idea here, not mixing those two perspectives up, but actually trying to have a specific dedicated investor perspective. And the general idea here is now that whenever you want to do some policy design, policy interventions or so, you actually have two, or you in general have two approaches here. You could think about making the market work better, but on the other hand, you could also say, let's not try to cure the disease if you want, but to work on the symptom side, meaning enhance return or take risk or something like that. So these are the two general approaches you would have. And I'll now take 3 of the examples where I've put the circles around to be more concrete, to make it actually tangible. So let's
perhaps just 2 examples. Sorry, we need to come to an end.
2 examples, fine. I'm not going to put it to vote which ones. So I'll start with an example of inefficient investment in water infrastructure. So just imagine the situation you have for water scarcity and water infrastructure. The pipes actually are bad. Now, what is the barrier in terms of, from an economic perspective? It's that, well, there's no market price for water. And so if that's not really expensive, investment isn't really attractive. Okay, so option 1 would be, okay, the hard-nosed economist perspective, like, let's introduce a market price for water and then investment will be more attractive. Now, do you want that? That's the question. You might imagine an environment with which that is an option, but I could certainly imagine lots of situations where that's not an option. So the alternative, option 2, would be not to look from the market theory perspective, but actually from the compensation perspective and saying, okay, let's keep the subsidized low water price because that's what I want. But then I have to understand it's a market imperfection. I have to make the investment more attractive. So the one idea would be provide concessional finance, water efficiency credit lines by public finance institutions or something else. But realize the market imperfection and make it sort of steer it by hand to make it more attractive. Perhaps I'll kick out the urban heat island example and just go to the climate weather risk example. Let's imagine a case where climate risks are increasing because climate change is moving forward, but you cannot really, that means for, agriculture activities, perhaps also for infrastructure builders or whatever, that you need insurance because you have, climate risk coming. So sometimes you might observe that on the market, there will be no insurance provided. So, that is, in a perfect market, you can insure everything you want. That's not the case here. So that is a market that, in a way, that would be an imperfect capital market. Again, 2 options would be try to go from the market perspective, meaning somehow try to facilitate that the market provides this insurance. That would mean probably to start entering public-private partnerships, provide data collection that actually private insurances can offer, something like an insurance product, because it needs to be attractive for them as well. But in general, the other option would also be, okay, the government can just try to fill that gap by, using a climate finance institution, public finance institution to just take the risk, meaning provide a guarantee or, provide an insurance at a certain price. Note here that how that guarantee is priced or that insurance that's provided by the government is priced is in principle a completely separate discussion. Market imperfection can be avoided if it's just, you can actually provide an insurance at a certain price. You can also give it for free, but then that is actually already combining a sort of subsidy element with the insurance, which might be what you want. So that's key to this. And when sort of reconsidering what this means, we basically put together something like an agenda. If you're thinking about designing, say, a larger fund or whatever, and try to design a policy program to go about this, how can this all be used, essentially? So first, identify sectors and themes that you want to address in a specific program. As I said, the whole problem is so heterogeneous, it's really good to focus on individual themes where you want to start with. So identify those themes. Major tool would be this table that we've provided with the different activities and the themes. And then identify the relevant barriers. Major tool in the study is this table. Look at your sector, go through the table on barriers and try to identify what are the major barriers in that sectors. And then decide for the major barriers that you identify, decide whether you want to go through policy approaches or whether you say, let's try for the public financing support approach in the different areas, different market imperfections, and then formulate the policies. of course, then we will probably learn a lot when first policies are formulated or support programs are formulated and tried. So monitor and try to adjust the programs. That's essentially part of it. There's a couple of more policy conclusions, but I think for the sake of time, I'll stop here. And thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ulf. I'd just like to express thanks to a number of people, actually, organizations involved in the development of the study. By the way, the study that Ulf has presented there's a couple of copies of the executive summary here, but you can go to our website, unepfi.org, and it's on the home page. You can download the full study from there. I'd like to thank BMZ for the support in the study and many people working on it. Ulf Moslener, Laura Druce at the Frankfurt School did the bulk on it, but colleagues from DIE in Germany, Climatekos, were also involved, and thanks goes to all of them, and so does to colleagues at GIZ who were instrumental in helping making this study happen. Without further ado, Louis, the floor is yours. Now we're going to zoom in to a very specific tool.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Ulf talked about the fact that there was insufficient money flowing down to adaptation. And I'm going to talk about a tool, a very practical tool, which will help decision makers to understand more the risk and how much it costs to do adaptation. I do think that one of the reasons why there's no more money flowing down to adaptation is because people don't really understand what it is, and they don't understand the risk, and they don't understand how much it costs to remediate this risk. One word which you will hear a number of times in my presentation is the word actuaries. I don't know whether many people know who they are. Actuaries are sort of the statistical probabilist engineers of the insurance business. There's people who decide how much money you should pay on your premium and how much money should be put in reserves and etc. And the whole concept is to use tools used in the insurance business on the adaptation side. Seems to have a technical issue.
Top yours.
Okay, so I'll go. Very, very briefly, as everyone expects and knows, there's massive amounts of money which will be necessary on the adaptation side. We're talking about tens of trillions. I'll go over these slides very quickly. Adaptation is a big pressure on all the infrastructures, whether they are public but also private infrastructures. There's all the heat, precipitation, sea level rise, and etc. Many of those. They will have direct impact on transport, railroads, etc. I will not go through these slides. I think everyone knows about these big pictures of impacts that climate change is supposed to bring, and the adaptation that we have to do to face it. As Ulf explained, there's some direct impacts and indirect impacts. And also cascade impacts, which happens over time. I'll go quickly. There we are getting to something which is quite more interesting for us, is the distinction that we may establish between catastrophes and what we would call incremental impacts in climate change. The catastrophe side is what everyone think about usually, is all those storms, hurricanes, floodings, and etc., which has been happening around the world in a more intensive, with a larger amplitude and a bigger frequency. Also, it seems, in the last few years. Well, not only it seems, but it is the case. And the reinsurers, the people insuring the insurance business, know about that and have teams of people already looking at that and trying to assess how much this amplitude has been increased and how much this frequency has been increased. However, that's not the whole picture. The whole picture also includes a slow increase of temperature, which will bring some strains on the infrastructures. That's not, that doesn't appear in the catastrophe side. There's also an increasing frequency of heat waves, which don't necessarily mean catastrophes. There's also an increasing changing precipitations. Again, that's not frequencies. There's an increasing frequency of floods. There's increasing frequency of small storms. The one which wouldn't mean big insurance claims, but nonetheless put a lot of strains on the infrastructure. So this whole side of things which is not really taken into account at this stage because the insurance policies don't come into the picture. Nonetheless, all those events put more strains on the infrastructures and therefore erodes them faster. And what happens is that when a catastrophe comes, they break more easily, or over time they deteriorate and they need to be refurbished. And the whole question is, well, when do we need to refurbish? What do we need to refurbish? Should we refurbish these things as opposed to that thing first, etc., etc.? There's tons of questions linked to uncertainties with adaptation to climate change in the future, and that's what we are trying to we're trying to address here in a very practical manner. So we are designing as I was saying, adapting a tool which is quite widely used in all the projections of the insurance business to bring it into the adaptation arena. So what's important first is to scope the risk of possible impact. I've put at the bottom actually, so Addactis, Pascal, who is here, who is the chairman and CEO of Addactis, will be on the panel later, and he's an actuarial firm specialized in software to make projections. Again, applied to insurance, and which we are translating to be applied to adaptation. And the first thing we are looking at is adapting to the ports. How adaptation is necessary in the harbors, in the ports. So back to the list of bullet points. Well, we need to understand the risk better. It's important to assess the degree of vulnerability using stochastics, so the word which will come quite often. I don't know how many of you are familiar with stochastic analysis. Stochastic analysis is basically looking at the probability of something happening and making it vary. So we threw a lot of scenarios around this probability, okay? And then since there's a lot of parameters and a lot of things happening together, it's all those sort of spaghetti graphs coming together, which will define an area where we are most likely to be in the future. No one knows the future, obviously, otherwise we would be all very rich. However, we try to assess in due course, in 10 years, 20, 30 years, where we are most likely to be with what we know of the event and the impacts that it may have. I'll go quickly to the last two. Try to produce a short list of priority investment, cost and timing. So that's what we're trying to get to. As I was saying, trying to corner the risk in a way that we can actually assess how much it's going to cost and when is it likely to happen in terms of climate resilience to infrastructures. To increase the understanding and facilitating the decision that decision maker will have invariably to take on these things. At the moment, we're a bit in the fog in the adaptation side. We're progressing, but we don't exactly know what it should be and when it should be and how much it should be and etc. But it's to try to quantify that and to have probabilistic model to bring this with more light and being able to take more informed decisions. That's just to try to illustrate all what I've been talking about. That's a map of London by night. And many things can happen in a city like London. Many things can happen due to climate change over time, obviously. and it's important when we build such a model is to find the boundaries of the risk, find where are the most critical areas of a city or of a place which will be more prone to impacts of climate change. There's a whole of planning which needs to be done beforehand to know the risk better. That's again giving examples of where the location of critical infrastructure may be, whether it's in low-lying area, whether it's in hospital, whether it's a water treatment station, power stations, and etc., etc. All those critical areas needs to be assessed to be where the concentration of risk exists, and then around that build the models and project what those likely impacts may happen. As Robert was saying first, we first got into that. Maybe I should back one step. I'm actually an actuary by training. I'm a UK and French actuary, and I've been doing that for a bit over 15 years. And in 2001, I took 6 months off, and I decided to try to do something more useful with my life. I don't know whether I've achieved it, but I went back to studies in Imperial College in the UK in climate change, and then subsequently worked in climate change. So I've done the work of an actuary, and I've been doing a work of a climate change, climate finance expert for the last 15 years or so. So we've done a job within the Climatekos on the ports of Morocco for the EBRD, looking at the impacts and what sort of adaptation measures could be taken. But it's very literal. It's not quantified very much. At the moment, there's not much quantifications around the adaptation. And as I was saying before, what sort of costs in the future we're most likely to face, what sort of option we're most likely to face, what sort of timing we're most likely to face. Okay, none of those answers were answered in our work. So that's the different steps, and I talked through them a little bit before. The 5 phases that you need to go through when you do these sort of things. And we are more especially interested in number 2 and number 4. Number 1, establish a context around the ports. Number 2, identify the current vulnerability of future risk. And then understand better this risk, evaluate it. Number 4, then it's what sort of measure will we take? Once we've understood better this risk in the future, we have all our options. So what options should we take? We are not going to rebuild the whole infrastructures everywhere in the world, obviously. We need to prioritize. We need to plan things. And that's where the timing and the cost come into the picture. And then obviously number 5, it's monitoring and evaluating those risks over time. So number 2 is looking at the projections of risk. So using stochastic projections, again, using a combination of probabilities and statistics to be able to project all those scenarios to try to, and I'm reviewing myself, trying to corner those risks and understand roughly where they will be. And once we've done that, we are doing the same thing, but with the same projections again, but looking at the options and the cost side of things. So there's two areas where you need to project things, corner the risk, and then translate this risk into financial, how much it will cost, and when it's likely to happen. This slide is looking at, on the right-hand corners, is mostly what we are doing at the moment. So we are looking at adaptation from a very deterministic angles, meaning we are looking at it from how much is it likely to cost? Okay, let's do that first, let's do this first, but without quantifying it. And what we are suggesting here is to adapt models to be able to be on the left-hand side route, where through all those risks, we are able to assess in due course the loss and the exposure of the assets. That's giving a quick picture of what this modeling tool does. It is used in insurance. It has been used with earthquakes within these companies. And that's one of the screen on the top left, which gives of the projections of earthquakes. You have also well, from this modeling tool, you incorporate all the types of parameters which are at play. You incorporate how those parameters will evolve in the future, which is a combination of history. You don't always have historical data, especially for climate change, but also you need to extrapolate those data, potentially and quite often using other things which have happened which have similarities. You have also experts' opinion who knows their stuff. They have a sense for what is going to happen in the future and how what has happened so far will evolve in the future, and bringing these experts' opinion in building those models. And once you have all this, then you have probability curves which will be used to project again those likely risk and in due course cost. So that the outputs coming from the models are basically the boring three ones that you can see here, the Gaussian and the diffusion graph and the projection graph. And what we want to produce as well is a visualization of this. And so, for instance, on the map at the top, which is actually a map of New York, which was done for the floodings, see in due course what sort of amount of flooding infrastructure you would have to redo and etc. At the bottom, it's the estuary near London, yeah, with the same sort of thing. Quickly, strengths and challenges. You want something which is adaptable to stakeholders, which is powerful. You don't want to be limited by time and number of parameters and the type of data, and that's what this model does. You want something which is transparent. All the calculations at every step can be interrogated and followed through, which is very important. It's not a black box. It's a fully open model, which has been used for years in the insurance business. And it's not something which has just been developed. You want to be something which can be used to learn about historical data and process modeling. That's what I was talking about before. The risk will evolve and change over time. You want this to be also included in the model. We've talked about the data. I mean, quite often you have a lack of historical data, and you need to compensate that with other approaches, which I've just talked about. It has to be accessible and understandable by non-experts. One thing which is worth thinking about, if you think about the first curves that I had with those trillions of dollars due to adaptation, whether it's on the public or the private side, a discount rate, the risk what we usually call the risk discount rates. All those cash flows which will be in the future, you have to look at their present value. What do they mean today? And when you want to look at what do they mean today, you have to take the present value with a rate, and sort of an interest rate, a risk discount rate. What rate you take here obviously will dictate very big fluctuation in those amounts. And so it's important to understand those rates, and depending on what we do, again, have some simulation on those rates and saying, okay, well, the most likely thing is that this rate should be around there, and that means roughly that sort of amount. Of course, nothing is specific and precise because we're talking about stuff in the future. But to assess in the best way possible all this, that's the end of my presentation. Just before I came, I was making some comments about the fact that now they can use the Arctic way. I'm not sure everyone will find a good side of what climate change is bringing in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we've heard the two presentations that are part of this session. Ulf's helicopter perspective, in which he identified as one of the barriers the issue that's very prominent in climate adaptation. There's a lack of information. There's unavailable information. There are information asymmetries. And now you've heard in great detail what the solutions to that barrier can look like in the real world. I want to invite the panelists now. We have still half an hour to join the stage already. We have 30 minutes to hear some reactions from different stakeholders on these presentations that we've heard so far. I'll start introducing the panelists, and then we will try to make some time towards the end. Sadly, only 10 minutes or so for Q&A also with yourselves in the audience. We have at the very, from your side, the right hand end of the table, Angelika Frey-Oldenburg from GIZ. GIZ has been working heavily with SMEs and other companies in developing countries in supporting their own adaptation, so very much on the demand side of adaptation financing, and she will provide us some perspectives on that. I'll introduce the rest of you as we go along, but the floor is yours, Angelika. Your reactions.
Thank you so much, and please stop me because, well, I prepared something, but stop me if I'm over time. Thank you so much for being invited, and just let me also introduce myself very, very briefly, because I'm head of a global program on behalf of the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, and as Remco already said, we are working with small and medium enterprises. And we are, in fact, developing approaches, instruments for the private sector to adapt to climate change in 4 different countries. One is Bangladesh, one is in Central America with hub to Costa Rica, Morocco, and Rwanda. And we are really working together with the private sector on the demand side. We are working with private sector associations, but as well as with companies. And within this work, we gathered a lot of experience on what the private sector needs to adapt. We also discovered the very close linkage between the private sector, the demand side, and what Ulf mentioned, the supply side, because it is a little bit what we discovered, the hen and the egg problem. Banks often told us when we were talking with them about, and for example, an adaptation fund, they say, okay, is there really a demand from the private sector side, from the company side? And on the other hand side, the companies told us, well, how can we get financing? But before I'm coming back to our program and to our experiences, I would just like to react a little bit on the financial issues and the study we were talking about today, and Ulf was presenting, and also our program was supporting. Because we thought we need to demystify. Why do we need to demystify? Because we think private sector and financing is a very, very broad approach. And in my terms of view, there are 3 different pillars. I think the most common pillar we are right now currently discussing about, that is how can we mobilize private money, for example, from institutional investors to fill this huge gap of the 100 billion, and how can we mobilize private money from international capital market, from assurance companies. The second pillar, I think that is also important, is how can we mobilize equity investors to invest in new opportunities, in new markets, in new products, in new technologies. And the third dimension, we at the moment a little bit underestimate, in my point of view, is the huge potential of private actors, of private companies as investors themselves. Because we think that private companies invest with their own capital, but they lead a leverage from, for example, the banks, or maybe also from the public side, to be better motivated. This is for me a very, very important distinction when it comes to differentiate between the different aims and the different areas we are talking when we are talking about mobilizing private investment. I think we need to distinguish. The same is where we need to distinguish when we address the private sector, because private sector is the same as public sector. There are a lot of different dimensions. And this brings me also to the point that For example, mitigation is global, adaptation is local, and very individual. So it is a really need to distinguish in our experience what kind of private sector are we talking about? Are we talking about the financial sector who need to mobilize money to provide it to the market? Are we talking about companies? And here, are we talking about international, multinational companies? Are we talking about small and medium enterprises, of whom we are talking about? And for each target group, we need different concepts. But I think for all versions and for all targets groups in the private sector, it is important when we want to mobilize them to have a business case. For investor, it needs to be attractive as well as for the company owner and for the bank. It needs to be to have a yield for their investment. I think this is important to know the motivation behind the private sector. What is, in our point of view, within the 4 countries we are working in, the 4 regions, we have really different approaches. We work with, what I said, with business associations, but also with different sectors and with different sizes of the companies. But what is really interesting for us and why it is so important for us to have this study to show these different market asymmetries. Because driving investments is not all about having an environmental or a surrounding environment for investors. We need to have also more emphasis on the asymmetric information, what Ulf told us. It is not always about providing capital. I think in our experience, it is very important to provide the right information to the right target group.
One more minute, Angelika.
Oh, sorry. Well, I just started. For us, it is important to really elude the lack of information on both sides, on the private sector side, on the company side, as well as on the banking side and financing side. And we need to go very, very precisely. We need to show them how climate impacts in general form is really impacting their real business. That's why we are working with companies on case studies. We show them exactly how this climate impact is really influencing their costs and benefits balance. And the same is when it comes to link this demand with the banking demand. So also banks need to be better informed how they can bring in their money and how they can assess risks within their asymmetric information. Maybe I can elude a little bit how we work within or with the private sector, because we use a kind of also assessing risk tool. It is called the Climate Expert, where we go with the private sector through several dimensions to see how they are really affected. If they are affected, for example, within their logistics, within their stocks, or within their production, and then they, on this basis, they can define a kind of adaptation plan and adaptation measures. With this strategy, they can go to the bank and show them, okay, we have strategically eluded the different dimensions, and now we need to invest in this and this and this area because it affects our businesses. To be honest, we need to distinguish between measures that are more risk-oriented or measures that are more cost-saving oriented. This is at the moment a very big appetite, for example, when it comes to water recycling systems. On the third is, of course, the opportunity side, when they develop new products, when they want to step in new markets. This is a very diverse dimension, but with this kind of systematically approach, it's a little bit the same you developed. With this kind of systematically approach, companies will understand that there is a very basic need to invest in climate change issues. And to be honest, with the companies we're working in, we had here in Morocco, in Agadir, we had an event with 200 participants, most of them CEOs from big companies and from companies here in this region. And they were very, very interested in knowing more about assessing the risk and about knowing. So I think the knowledge basic is a very, very important dimension. We should not we should prioritize in the main aspects as we prioritize the capital financing. Well, I have a lot of other things and experiences. Maybe I can bring it in a little bit later, because we have also a very, very good experience in Morocco with an industrial zone. We did this assessment and we have a lot of success, because in a kind of PPP, we mobilized 1 million dirham plus 2 million dirham for a kind of reconstruction of this industrial park. But it was only because we provided a kind of very common process with information and a more strategical orientation of both sides, of the public side and the private side. I stop here because, you know, working now 2 years on exactly this topic and exactly knowing what the private sector needs and drives, it's a very, very big dimension. And for the financial part, it is now really mature to go to the next step, to say the demand side from the small and medium enterprises, it is now clear that there is a demand. Now we need to go to the financial issue and see how it can fit maybe with blended finance funds, how can we fit it with other kind of possibilities of financing and or for insurance solutions. Just to go and to show you this possibility in this huge dimension. And we think we really underestimate, I'm very, very emotional in this, because we are working with these companies and we underestimate, to be honest, this new market and this new market potential.
Thank you, Angelica. Thank you also for shedding light on some aspects on the demand side of adaptation finance. We need to be very nuanced as to who constitutes demand. It's a wide range of actors, ranging from micro, small enterprise, all the way to multinationals and large infrastructure sponsors. And we need to understand their motivation. And we need to understand that for them to be motivated, they need information, they need knowledge. And those are current challenges. But you're saying there's an increasing demand for private adaptation finance. It's not quite there yet. But I wonder whether, I can turn to you, Verena Trevor from Allianz Climate Solutions. Do you see, you very much in this panel represent the supply side of financing, even though, of course, most of Allianz business is more on the insurance underwriting side rather than the financing side, but you'll have to play that role now. Do you see that demand? Is this a topic, for Allianz, and where do you see the challenges?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. And Allianz is a big institutional investor. And actually, when I go to my colleagues and want to talk about adaptation finance, then I look into faces which don't know what I'm talking about. And I think, are we very ignorant in our sector, or what is the problem? And actually, 1.5 years back, Christiana Figueres was at Allianz. We had our 125th anniversary, and she spoke to us and she said, "You are the risk gurus of society." And she meant the insurance industry also. For example, my colleague from Mignery is there, also meaning Mignery, Allianz, and insurers from all over the world. But even if we are risk experts, we don't understand actually what adaptation means. And again, are we ignorant? Probably not, because I had a quick look at the INDCs or NDCs, and actually even in the conditional INDCs, which should talk about finance, only 60% quantify their finance needs. And of these 60%, only half of it make a difference between adaptation finance and mitigation finance. So actually, if not even the experts or the countries have started to think in this direction, maybe they have started, but it's difficult to put it in the INDCs. I don't want to say they are slow or anything, but this basis is not there. So I would not say that we are ignorant in the sector, that we have not understood yet what adaptation finance is about. So I would say adaptation finance is still a mystery, even if we have tried to demystify it. It's a mystery. That is my first message. Second message is the finance does not exist. As we have heard, there is microfinance institutions up to institutional investors. We as institutional investors are interested in projects of around 100 million per project to finance. This is combinable with adaptation finance when we look at infrastructure projects, big infrastructure projects, but not, at least not very easily when we look at adaptation efforts of small, medium enterprises in Morocco, at the coast of Morocco. Then it's a little bit more tricky to say the finance, adaptation finance. So we have to really start to differentiate. Third message, and then I have a fourth one, and then I'm done. Great. Third message is that we should be thinking of traps when we talk about adaptation finance. For mitigation finance, the economic upside of these investments was really easy. Allianz has invested over 3 billion in renewable energy because it's a very profitable investment. If that would be the case for adaptation, we would have done so already as well. But we have already heard people talking about positive externalities. How can you invest, for example, in a dam when then the positive effects are for all the neighborhood, but not only for maybe your own company? So it's much more complex, and I would say we have lots of economic questions to answer before we can say adaptation finance is as easy to do as mitigation finance. So look out for the economic traps. And my last point would be actually a question. On the one side, we are already seeing impacts of climate change. So we are probably really late in discussing adaptation finance now today. But maybe we are also already before our time, because we have heard from Angelika that lots of technical assistance is, for example, needed to help people understand their adaptation needs, make risk assessments. So this is probably the first step, bottom up, helping companies, helping households, helping regional governments, and then governments understand what their adaptation needs are. And then we can start to talk and see what finance instruments are there. So we are late, but we are also just at the start of things. And I think I would leave it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rene. Very, very clear. On one of your points, I'd just say, of course, you're an institutional investor. You have certain requirements on the volumes of financing that you're interested in providing. Of course, had we had a commercial banking representative here, that person would have not, that person doesn't need 100 million. That person needs much smaller amounts that might be relevant to the types of SMEs that Angelika is working with in developing countries.
Yeah,
but,
and also quickly to add, I mean, as an insurance company, we could also talk about insurance as a mean of adaptation. Maybe we will have the time during questions. Right. And this is definitely something where also insurance can come in when we are talking about small and medium enterprises. We're already doing that.
I don't think we will have the time today, perhaps bilaterally with the panelists, but let me give the floor to Pascal Mignery from Addactis. There's a recurring theme here. There's question marks and question marks. People still don't know what is adaptation, what are concrete, options for action on adaptation. And And what I would be interested to hear from you is, how can decision makers really use, the very complex type, models that are being developed in their day-to-day decisions, in the public and the private sector.
Hello, I totally agree with my colleague, my colleague from insurance. I am an actuary coming from the insurance sector, and clearly, I'm not an expert on climate change as you are, and what I will talk about is only about mathematics and about modeling. And first, I love your presentation with only 4 points, so I will try to do it also. First one is the major problem is not for actuaries and modelers to interpret a model that was built, but on the other side, it is to model a very complex universe according to stochastic methods first, and with an actuarial approach. These 2 words are very important: stochastic for the technique and actuarial for the approach. Stochastic, it means, for example, you heard sometimes a value at risk, and it's a typical an actuarial and stochastic ID. This idea of value at risk. Second point, on top of that, a model is only based on available data and feasible assumptions. It means the calibration of parameters of a stochastic model is very critical concerning the relevance of the results. Better a simplistic model that is well calibrated than a very complex one, poorly parameterized. Oh yes, let's go to third point. A study of the on concrete and local effects on a population, an area, a company, still has more impact than an overall study, because human nature is such that we always think it only happens to others, and if it would happen, it's a very long term. So we should focus on local effects. In our side, we don't have an universal model or even specific models. We are working on building and improving very, very local and specific models based on local data and specific experiences. And the last thing is about the advice of the actuary. The actuary I am will advise to work more accurately on more local basis and on the real effect on local climate change. This way, the models are much more efficient. And as you don't know, but actuaries have participated for years in climate change researches. And next step is, as you said before, is to use models, actuarial models, and actuarial modeling experience in the climate change field, because I think we will improve together, working together. That's it.
Thank you very much, Pascal. And then finally, I'd like to give the floor to Leah Nicholson, who's a technical advisor at the Environment Department of Antigua and Barbuda, a member of AOSIS. What does a developing country government, make of all this discussion? The private sector, SMEs, private financing, and then all the stochastic and statistical approaches to informing decision making.
Thank you. Yes. Good afternoon. And while my presentation gets pulled up, hopefully, I will give a little introduction to the Department of Environment in Antigua and Barbuda. We're changing gears a little bit. I hope you can feel the tropical heat already. And so we are the national implementing entity for the Adaptation Fund. We're the NDA for the Green Climate Fund. We're multilateral environmental agreements. That's our department, and also involved in the development process nationally, physical planning. I have a few slides to keep me on track. If I could ask the Secretariat to, okay, fantastic. Well, I'll get one step ahead of the presentation so we can get in. Just starting off with a couple key messages as the basis to orient what I'm going to talk about. So there is a clear need to scale up private sector financing for adaptation. And we have seen the huge adaptation financing gap from UNEP, and these numbers are constantly being updated. And adaptation to be a very local process. We have local impacts, we have dynamic cultural responses, we have very different, we get 1/3 rain on the eastern side to what we get on the western side. And so that merits different approaches in a small island like Antigua and Barbuda. So it's a very locally driven process. And the third kind of key to developing country private sector institutions in many countries. Thank you, we're almost there. And so when we talk about unlocking private finance, we have, okay, so here's my beautiful beach photo from Antigua, and jumping straight into these key messages. So we have capacity constraint. Unlocking is, there are existing barriers, and we're aware of those barriers. They're knowledge barriers, but critically, because we are already experiencing the impact, there's implementation barriers. So there's difficulty accessing finance and the constraints of the country in general. So I'm going to go a little bit into what that means. Firstly, this country-driven approach, zooming into what adaptation means for the context of Antigua and Barbuda. And really, so here are adaptation NDC targets, which were fortunately quantified for finance at about 20 million a year estimated. Increasing desalination by 50%, we're extremely dry country, 3-year water deficit droughts, and for several months last year, 100% reliant on desalination. So very dry country. The second adaptation target is to prepare all buildings for these extreme events, drought, hurricanes, and flooding. We're looking at the off-grid energy for the water sector. If we get a drought combined with an electricity, then we cannot generate water. So you're looking at multiple vulnerabilities, protecting all watersheds and waterways to prevent flooding, and then more recently, the health impacts associated with vector-borne mosquito, Zika and chikungunya and so on. And then affordable insurance schemes for farmers, fishers, and businesses. I'm going to use a case study specifically about this on preparing all buildings for extreme climate events and how we're involving the private sector in this context. So first of all, of course, we've heard that private sector is not unanimous. So what does it mean to Antigua and Barbuda? We're looking at financial institutions, banks, small farmers, and the kind of homeowners and small businesses, which is that third picture there. Those account for about 20% of GDP. The vast majority, nearly 80%, is the bottom, is tourism. So this is a huge economic driver. So when we're talking about private sector, what contributes to GDP and where is that activity? And the challenge is really facing the private sector. So they're already paying for many adaptation measures, 3-year drought, the increased cost of water under those circumstances. We're looking at one hurricane can wipe out 30% of the country's GDP, and that's shared across these different sectors. So you're looking at huge impacts, and we're 1 degree above pre-industrial levels temperature-wise. So as for how are we helping the built infrastructure sector, so that's really homeowners and small businesses, to adapt to climate change and starting to address this barrier. We're establishing a national environmental fund, which includes climate change investment. And this is really to invest in the different issues through dispersing through different mechanisms, insurance, small loans, and a revolving fund. and driving through reinvestments in the SURF fund where possible and additional input. So the approach is to, this was legislated last year, it's currently being operationalized, and some adaptation measures are extremely high. Generally in small islands, it's very high per capita cost of adaptation. If we look at pooling the resources, and we got back to some of this before, investment in water, where it's politically not feasible to raise levies, what are your other options? And we're taking this approach where you may have higher costs that can be subsidized by maybe easier, lower cost adaptation activities, so that we can really focus on some of the technical adaptation options and needs. So this is the revolving fund. And one thing we've found that it's really important to take this route, because part of the climate risk awareness raising is that you can distort market and we're looking at household, like land devaluing in areas that we were deeming high impact and very vulnerable to climate change. So when you're doing that, now we're providing options through the SURF fund so that people can take measures to adapt to these impacts that we're raising awareness about. And so that's a very important environmental social safeguard measure that we've taken. So moving forward, what does this look like in practice? Well, if I'm a household owner, I can look at a booklet that we're creating, trying to break down these knowledge barriers and choose different adaptation options that would be relevant. So reinforcing roofs based on a building code and environmental management system. So that's where your regulatory environment is. But those are already on the books and people aren't taking them up because of access to financing is extremely high cost of capital. And even with insurance, we're looking at extremely high rates. So these are just some of the adaptation options, water and flooding, that we've been looking at through the SURF fund. It's hopefully operationalized in 2017 and we'll start to demonstrate it. So in conclusion, I think that there are opportunities to, in these sort of areas, in the country-driven process where we're looking at opportunities to involve in the household and urgent need areas. So by doing this revolving fund, we will slowly hand over the program. So we would like banks to be investing in these areas in adaptation measures, have that be more of a known one, but they're not for the cost of capital is not, does not permit it. And in some cases, there's not that we're looking at vulnerable households. So there's, it's a concessional fund. So it's 3% rates, unsecured loans. We need to start getting data on those areas. So SIDS face challenges of economies of scale. When I said where possible, if we look at a country level and what is the cost of protecting your coastline, how can the private sector get involved in that? I think we really need to look at where it's possible and where we need to continue to have public focus on investment and grant-based adaptation financing. I think, generally speaking, looking at our context, there will always be a need for grant-based resources. With our revolving fund, with a $3 million investment into that, the financial model showed that the value added of doing a revolving fund would be 5.8 million. So if we're looking at our country and what it would cost to adapt our country, a $3 million through the revolving fund can generate much more impact at the level through unsecured and kind of socially appropriate means. And so coming up with this tailored approach, understanding the context. Finally, I think we've touched a little bit on economic theory and perfect market-based solutions. And so that's really in theory versus in reality. There's the public funds, it's not a perfect system, even with adaptation financing. There are, once you're using public sources, there's constraints both on the recipient and the supporting entities. And so how do we manage those processes to make sure that we're meeting the needs on the ground? And especially once we start to get into those infrastructure investments, how will we in practice bring in adaptation financing to some of those large-scale public investments and merging with support from the private sector? So one final comment on some of what we've heard is that when we're looking at adaptation in SIDS, there's already reinsurers pulling out of the region, and we're at 1 degree, and we're looking at heading into a 3 or 4 degree region. So as we get better analysis at the reinsurer scale and at insurance level, what does that mean for regions like the Caribbean, where we're not able to find affordable insurance rates as it stands? And what does that mean for our private sector entities like the hotels and the farmers and where our GDP is coming from, for their ability to support on adaptation? And so we see a need for a holistic approach to addressing this issue of adaptation financing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leah. I've been a bad moderator. I really wanted to ensure some Q&A with the audience, but we've unfortunately run out of time. You've seen, this is a wide field with many different nuances and perspectives to it, and it's filled up the 90 minutes that we had at our disposal. Just want to emphasize one point that Leah basically, or one key takeaway to me, is private financing, of course, is important. It will probably be the bulk of adaptation financing, but that doesn't mean, of course, that there's no role for public financing. There's a clear role for public financing in capacity building, in unlocking those private financial flows in building markets. And with that, core and a little bit political message, I'd like to conclude, and I'd like to ask you joining me in putting our hands together for our panelists and presenters.
Ça, 1, 1, 2. CE 1, 2, vous m'entendez? 1, 2, 3, 4. Vous me recevez? Oui? Ah non? Ah, pardon. OK. 1, 2, ça, A. CE. Ça, A, c'est pas normal.